It looks like what is that ancient Chinese curse? May you live in interesting times. Well, we certainly have arrived at interesting times. And I think this is a good time to learn a couple of powerful ways of increasing your thinking power. And you don't have to do this, no one has to do this, but I think it gives a certain amount of power and integrity to what you have to say. So I'm going to try and use the methods that I have come up with over the years to force myself to think, even when it's painful. That is, even when it turns out that I'm wrong. That's always painful. It is my general idea that we are headed toward an era of rule by intellectual elites. It's the first time that intellectuals, people who produce words, nothing else, but words are powerful, who are in charge in both the United States and in Europe. And I think let us say, the revolts against the elites are mixed into this situation. A lot of people feel that they're being run over by these ideas conjured up by this intellectual elite, which is now centered on our college campuses. The position of these people is that there's something wrong, irredeemably evil about Western civilization, about America, about white people, and my luck, Israel to boot. It's a messy situation, but I think we're going to keep coming up with instances where we see the influence of this intellectual elite. This elite believes that they, like other religious fanatics, have come to redeem mankind. That all was dark in the world, but don't worry, we are here and we will change things for the better. And in some ways, they have made changes for the better. They've stopped the discrimination against gays, for example. They've raised up women a great deal. And so there's a lot of good there. But in the end, they aim to dominate. And they're not as interested in democracy as other people might be. They believe that they know better. They are smarter, wiser, and better people. And therefore, they should be in charge, which means that they will favor decisions made by judges and bureaucrats more than decisions made by the people. The people, they say, are misguided or don't understand that they are now seeing through a glass darkly, as it says in the Bible. But after you understand their point of view, the intellectual elite's point of view, you will see more clearly. They make alliances with the very wealthy because the very wealthy, I think, and in their view, certainly think that they don't care about anything but except making more money. For some reason, they don't want to retire after a couple of $1 billion. Chen and I would retire, but these people will not. And since the very wealthy only want to get wealthier, they can allow that. And if they don't allow it and tax them a little more heavily, the very wealthy have nowhere to go anyway. So they believe that rule by an elite is just a good idea if they are the elite that is ruling. They don't have a lot of emphasis on democracy because, you see, they view us, the common people out here, as misguided at best, evil at worst. So they tend to tamp down the emphasis on democracy. They like judges, they like bureaucrats more than they like voting on issues. The idea that America is a place where every man and woman can guide their own boat by their own lights is not attractive to them because they feel that people are always going wrong. They will reduce the role of the individual. For many, many years, the calling card of the West was individualism, was, well, what Martin Luther King said today. Well, today's Martin Luther King Day. And he said that he wanted a land where people were judged by the content of their character, by which he meant their ability, their capacity for hard work, their intelligence, their enthusiasm. Each person judged as an individual, not by some outside extraneous factor like skin color. And now we would add in gender or sexual orientation. We should be judged by our inners and not our outers. And so the individual, the idea of judging people as an individual is an idea that came out of the West, and so far has only succeeded in the West, although right now you have a number of countries, Japan and South Korea, that are doing as well or even better than we are in looking toward the individual and not some outer characteristics of being a human being here. There are a number of rules that I have that you might want to follow. First is deals with facts. You know, someone has said you have a right to your own views, but you don't have a right to your own facts. Facts matter. Let's say you look up, you were talking about deaths in the world and poverty and what caused the deaths there. Well, you may be surprised to learn that a lot of the deaths, we're talking in the millions here, come out of respiratory infection. Why don't we have deaths from respiratory infection here? I'm not talking about COVID, but I mean from the dust and dirt and pollution in the air. We don't have it here because basically we've cleaned up the air, believe it or not, we have cleaned up the air tremendously in America. And in poor countries, they often, for heat, for fuel, they use things like dung. Dung is exactly what you think it is. Dung contains little fibers. And when you burn the dung, all these little fibers are released into the air. That's why we discovered about 30 years ago, when there was an enthusiasm for fireplaces, that they weren't such a hot idea because they burned wood. And wood has little fibers in it that escape from the fire and eventually end up in your lungs. And that's why we've backed off on the use of firewood for fuel and heat. What do? Well, what we do in America is we have a giant place that generates electricity, either from coal, that's a little old-fashioned now, or from oil or natural gas or solar power. That's centralized, and then we send it out in lines all across the country. When we have tried to help people in third world nations, we have demanded that they do the opposite. We don't want a giant coal fire plant there. We don't want them to use oil. We don't want them to use gas. We want them to use, well, something else. Maybe solar power, but it's hard so far at least to use solar power in manufacturing and in a large scale. It's very, very difficult. So in effect, we are hurting the people in the third world when we don't let them do what we in fact do here. Another major problem is diarrhea, but not the funny type that we have in this country. Not even the little less or more funny stuff that we pick up in Mexico. No. Diarrhea can be a deadly, deadly disease. It means an immediate, across the board, evacuating of the fluids from your body. It has stopped entire armies. And what do we get this from? It's dirty water. Most people, when they think of problems in the third world, they think of people starving to death. And people do starve to death. That's another problem. But a lot of the problem comes from dirty water. Now, what do we do in America? Well, we throw tons of chemicals into the water, chlorine, and it cleans up whatever needs to be cleaned up there. They would like to do the same in the third world, but too often we say, no, chemicals are bad. We want you to do this in a natural sort of way. And they ask, well, what is that way? And we don't have a good answer. The problem is in the third world, they're poor. They are dependent on us in the rich world, and they have to do what we say. It's a darn shame some of the time that they have to do that. Let's take a disease that has wreaked havoc throughout the world, throughout the centuries, but not so much anymore in the West. Malaria. Malaria is a major killer. Between 1 and 2 million people die each year from malaria. Now, how did we get rid of malaria? Well, we basically filled in any swampy area. Swamps used to be called swamps. Now they're called wetlands, and people get mad if you try and fill them in. But wetlands harbor tremendous numbers of mosquitoes that cause malaria and hurt and kill people in the third world. You have to dry up any little stream, any little lake, not all of them, of course, but a lot of them that are wherever you have stagnant water. You are breeding malaria when you have stagnant water here. We used to fill in these places. We used to spray oil across the swamps. We used to do all sorts of stuff. And most of all, we used to use a chemical called DDT, which we sprinkled it all over everyone. If you look at after World War II, when people were in displaced persons camps, we just sprayed everybody with DDT. Maybe it did a little bit of harm, but it also saved millions upon millions of lives. But we don't want them to do that in the third world country. So we come up with what, in my opinion, are these cockamamie ideas, like why don't we hand out nets, mosquito nets, that'll keep out the mosquitoes when you sleep. It's not a bad idea, but so far it hasn't been fully implemented. And I noticed that we're not doing it here. When's the last time you slept under a mosquito net? We kill the little suckers, and we don't let them do it. And that's a darn shame, because a lot of the people that die first from malaria are children and old people. All right, there's another thing that we want to do, and we want to sort of force ourselves to use these methods because we have a terrific tendency, well, not to be honest with ourselves. Some people are, but a lot of people have a lot of trouble with that sort of thing. The next method that we ought to use if we consider ourselves people who think with integrity is comparative analysis. People say all sorts of things, for example, about taxes. High taxes leads to low prosperity. No, other people say low taxes equals high prosperity, and back and forth and around and around. Well, I did a research study on this, and it turns out that the degree of taxes is related to the prosperity of the nation, their growth rate in particular. But it's kind of an odd situation. It turns out that most of the developed world has very high taxes compared to the United States. And yet there are plenty prosperous. I mean, Europe has plenty of prosperous countries like Norway or Sweden and Denmark that have sky-high taxes. Germany has sky-high taxes. And yet the people live a pretty good life, it seems to me, in those countries. There's actually only one country, industrialized country in the world, that has low taxes the way the United States does, and that's Japan. So it turns out you can have low taxes and prosperity or high taxes and prosperity, although most of the examples of prosperity have much higher taxes than we have here. People don't usually either know this or stress it because they just want to argue for high or low taxes. This is something you might want to think about. Another thing you might want to think about is comparative analysis. This is powerful stuff, really powerful stuff. Basically, whatever public policy you want to think of, whatever public policy you have, that your friends have, that professors have, someone has tried it somewhere. I mean, we've been around for a couple of thousand years as human beings, and people have tried it. You want to try price control? All right. It's been tried 1,000 times before. You want to try high taxes, low taxes, whatever you want to try. People have tried it before, and we are damn fools. We are fools on roller skates if we don't look and see what happened there. Okay? If you use a comparative analysis, it's like bringing a gun to a knife fight. It's a good idea. Okay? So we make out a plan, or we think of a hypothesis. How does the world work? Let us say we say, well, I think when things get crowded, people get on each other's nerves and they kill each other or hit each other or rape each other or do something wrong. Okay, so this is the idea. Crowding causes crime. So what do? We look backwards in time. Or in this case, we look at other countries. We look in the past and we look in other countries. But then we run into a problem. You want a crowded country? Go to Japan. They have very low crime rates. Now you could say, well, that's an exception. Crowding causes crime. All right, let's look at another one. Would you like to go to the Netherlands? A lot of people in a small space, plus you're forced to wear wooden shoes. And yet they have very low crime rates. It turns out, I think, if you're being honest, that crowding probably doesn't help, but it certainly does not seem to be a major factor. And if you're an honest person, which is what we're going to need a lot of nowadays, you'll go along with that point of view. You'll at least question your initial analysis, your initial hypothesis. Here's another thing, and this is great stuff because it's like jujitsu. You can use your opponent's weight against themselves. This is opposing views. You're in luck. A lot of people disagree with you, in case you haven't noticed that lately. And whatever point of view you have, people have other points of view. Here's the great thing about it. They've done your work for you. In other words, someone out there hates your point of view and has done a lot of research to come up with evidence to show his point of view is better. So you don't have to do all the heavy lifting all the time. You can just grab hold of the other person's articles. For example, if you are conservative, but you think maybe the liberals have something to say, or maybe they don't, you read the New York Times. If you're a liberal and you want to know, well, are the conservatives all a bunch of racist jackasses? Maybe not, maybe yes. Read the Wall Street Journal. And these things are put out there every day, talking about whatever issue you want to talk about. Someone pretty smart, the people who write and report for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal are pretty damn smart. And if you are smart yourself, you'll take a look and see what the opposition has done. They've done half the work for you. By the way, I once heard someone from the Princeton Review, the SAT teaching group, say the best thing you could do is just start reading these newspapers in the 6th grade, and you do as well as anyone else will do on those tests. Here's another thing, numbers. Numbers are powerful. Now, a lot of people say, well, you know, liars and statistics go together, and that's true. Nonetheless, numbers are powerful. And I have a thing here where I should have marked before, but who cares? You might think that the more money you spend, the better health results you get. And to some degree, that's true. I mean, if you're not spending any money or you're spending every dime you have on healthcare as a country, you might do better or do worse. But here's something that might surprise you. And numbers make it solid. Numbers make the argument powerful. You might say, well, let's not even guess. Let's take a look here. You know who spends the most money on healthcare? The United States. This is from a few years back, but the medical cost per person per year is $6,000. That's okay, I guess. And we live for 77 years. Well, look, in Switzerland, they spend $4,000 and the life expectancy is 81 years. In France, they spend only $3,000 and the life expectancy is 80 years. What is the point? The point is there is some sort of a relationship with the amount of money you spend, at least at the extremes, but otherwise it's not quite clear. And if you look deeper into this, you find out the reason for this is that most of the factors that keep you healthy or not are not that well related to money. Yes, you need a doctor if you have cancer, obviously, unless you're an enthusiastic amateur who's a fool. But most people come to ill health because they eat too much or they eat the wrong thing. They don't exercise. They don't calm themselves down. They have no way to do it. They don't know how to do it, perhaps. They don't get sleep. All of these factors that are under your control actually have a lot more to do with your health and these dramatic things like cancer. Not that you shouldn't pay attention to cancer, but there are other factors. History. We are a nation that thinks too often that Henry Ford, the automobile manufacturer, was right when he said, history is bunk. No, it's not. It's a great school for teaching us. We are basically a democratic, I think, decent country because the founding fathers studied history. And by studying history, they outlined a government made for human beings. You can sit at a table and smoke strong cigarettes and drink even stronger coffee and come up with any idea you want. You can come up with an idea like Marx's, that people can be made perfect. But I don't think so. If you look at human history, there's a lot of imperfection there. Now, if you look at history and you see all this imperfection, you might want to ask yourself, what type of government should we have? Well, what we should have is a government like ours with checks and balances. We don't trust people that much. We trust them enough, so we're going to have freedom and democracy. That shows trust. But we also want to keep an eye each on the other. So we have a House of Representatives, we have a Senate, we have a president, we have a Supreme Court. And so we're kind of looking at things and moving slowly. We're not supposed to move that fast because we're worried of the evil that will come of that. So if you want to put in a law in the House of Representatives, go ahead, propose whatever you like. But the Senate's got to look at it, and they're going to look at it again and see what comes out of it. You'll compromise, you put something together, you send it to the president. Then the president looks it over and says, I like this, I don't like that. And then it can go to the Supreme Court. The point is that we trust people enough to have liberty and democracy, but we don't trust them enough to grant them absolute power. Countries where the rulers are granted absolute power, Russia, China, they don't work out so well. Also the French Revolution for a while. So we have a moderate level of trust of human beings, and that, I think, has turned out to be the right thing to do. And because of that, I think we have a fairly good government, at least compared historically with other governments. Double standards. This happens all the time, and unfortunately, from my point of view, it often happens with Israel. When Israel wins a war, the people say, oh yeah, they won it, but they used excessive force. I thought that's the way you're supposed to win a war. You have more force than the other guys, you know? When we started World War II, Hitler got a little worried when we joined in, and his propaganda chief, Goebbels, said, don't worry about the Americans. They can only produce radios and electric ice boxes. Within 1 year, we're out producing Germany and Japan put together. Within 1 year from a standing flat stop. And we showed them what we could do with our weapons. You should be aware when double standards are being used. We don't have excessive force. Excessive force is often the way you win. But if you want to damage somebody and say, yes, they often do this with Israel. Israel won, but they used excessive force. Well, I like that a lot better than when the Jews didn't have any force. But you keep that in mind and just mess around with it a little bit and see if the vocabulary has been deliberately skewed to blame one party instead of the other. Another thing is the agenda. We often are not aware of it. But how do we know what to think about during the day? What issues are important? Well, just turn on the TV, listen to the radio, go to your favorite website, and they'll tell you. They set the agenda. And basically, if you're not in the media, you don't exist. Just keep that in mind. the media basically outlines who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. And they do this more and more. The media used to be, in my opinion, more objective. They didn't necessarily demand that the Republicans or the Democrats were the good guys or the bad guys. They were more distant. They were less emotional and more objective, in my opinion. But keep in mind that certain things get in the media and certain things don't. And basically, we are captives of the media, period, period, period. Here's something that they have the power to do. On college campuses, people say that Israel is prejudiced against gays. Actually, they're the most advanced country in the world about gays. They had gays in the military for 10, 15 years ago. They have their own magazine. Anyway, they have the world's largest gay parade in Tel Aviv once a year. But the point is, unless someone says it in the media, it doesn't exist. It just doesn't exist. One thing you might not realize is that Christians are being exterminated in large parts of the Middle East and the other parts of the world as well. They are actually being crucified. Here's a picture. They're actually being crucified, Christians. But you don't hear anything about it. And it doesn't exist. If it's not in the media, it does not exist. If it's not in the media, it doesn't exist. A lot of people don't realize that there is still slavery in the world. The slavery is all in Muslim countries, by the way, but that's not politically correct to say that. So these people are enslaved. The slaves are always Arabs. The slaves are always black skin color, and the enslavers are always Muslims, but you don't know about it. If it's not in the media, it does not exist. Lately, there have been people who urged boycotts of products made in Israel. That's basically impossible. Half your electronics come from Israel. But nonetheless, they are trying to boycott it because they say it's a terrible country. Now, here's another point of view. He says, do you know who else used boycotts against Jews? And it shows, these are real pictures, Nazi soldiers standing in front of a Jewish-owned shop and saying, don't buy from Jews. But if it's not in the media, which it's not, well, you don't know anything about it here. Another thing, that you might want to keep in mind is whether you're looking at solutions or trade-offs. Some people think in terms of solution. If we do this, that'll get us out of the depression. We're about to get, I think it's nearly $2 trillion in aid to the whole country, which I happen to think is a good idea. But the idea is that this will solve our problems in getting out of our depression that we're in because of the pandemic. Maybe it will. But we also might want to think about whether or not there's another way to look at this. For example, what's the trade-off? Well, one trade-off is if we spend another $2 trillion, basically that's the end, most people feel. We can't borrow any more money after that. So if this $2 trillion doesn't work, if it's not allotted to the right group, we're in real trouble. And it might not be allotted to the right group. It's going to retired people like myself and my wife. We're not rich by any means, but we eat what we want to eat. We travel by car maybe, but we travel. We meet all of our bills every single month. And we have enough left over, so if we want to go out or we want to have a cat in the house, we can afford to pay for them as well. Is it possible that what we're looking at here is a trade-off? Doing something that's politically popular, but the trade-off is that it's not necessarily going to the people who need it. I, for one, would like to see the money go in a focused way to small business people that are just going out of business by the acre. I would like to see it the people who are so poor they can't pay their rent and they're going to be out on the street. I would like to see it go to people who can't afford to eat anymore. But the question is, I don't know what's the right solution, and no one else does either. We'll just try one thing after the other, which is fine with me. But the point is, you have to decide: are you looking at policy as a solution, or are you looking at it as a trade-off? The economists, depressed people though they are, say there's no such thing as a free lunch. I think they're right. We ought to keep that in mind. Okay. Here's another thing that happens. Comparing groups that are different. And this is often called comparing apples and oranges. Now, lately you hear a lot about Hispanics, and generally what you hear is they're not as well off as white people are. That's true. But are you comparing things you should be comparing? Or are there other factors that you've left out? For example, the longer you're in the country, the more prosperous you tend to be. Okay? Hispanics are kind of the last large immigration group coming to America. The level of education matters in how well off you are. Most Hispanics have a very low level of education before they come in America, and eventually it picks up and they're equal to other people. The larger the family, the less prosperous, because you have to spread the money out amongst more people. And they tend to have large families for one generation. Then they see what's going on here, and they have just one or two children. Also, if you speak English, that's always a good thing for getting better jobs, for getting a better education, for doing better in education. And they obviously arrived here speaking Spanish. These are things you have to keep in mind. Are you comparing things that should be compared or not? Here's another one close to that. Inputs or outputs. When politicians run for money, they run for money too. When politicians run for office and education is a hot topic, which it usually is, they say, I am going to put more money into education. I'm going to put more money into kindergarten, K through 12, college, whatever. Okay, that's fine. But the question here is, does it result in better education? Right now in New Jersey, we are spending about $10,000 more on people who live in poor areas. There are 28 designated poor educational areas, and we pay another $10,000 per student to help out the poor, the children who grow up in poverty. Well, that's an interesting thing, and I'm all for it, except for one thing. What's the result? What's the result? So far, I haven't heard of any results worth that matter. Now, if you want to go on spending the money, I guess you can if you're in charge. But we ought to look at the difference in inputs and outputs. Yes, you're doing this. Yes, you're doing that. Is it helping? And we often don't hear that part because that's not so popular. It's a lot easier to promise that this will help. You know, before the current debate about education in New Jersey occurred, one Supreme Court justice said, look, we really don't know if this will help, but we've got to try something, so we're going to spend a lot more money on particular minorities. And that's what we're doing. So far, no one seems to see any great results from that, but it's hard to back off from our initial idea that we'll spend more money, we'll get more educated people. The point is, when we think about stuff, it's hard as hell to revise our own thoughts. My thoughts on public issues are like old friends. They sit in the back of my head, they talk, they have a cup of coffee, they're happy with each other. And if I pull one of those thoughts out, it can shake up my entire head. I might have to switch from being more conservative to more liberal, or more liberal to more conservative. The point is, we're going to try and do this and have a fairly good time doing it. With the help of my friend Chen, we're going to become good thinkers during the coming year. and that'll be our share, what we'll do to help out the country. Thank you.